Good afternoon. This afternoon, for the next 25 minutes or so, I'll take you through my presentation, which, as you can see, is entitled Handset Evolution and Device Usage Patterns. So throughout the presentation, what I'll try and do is bring together, if you like, the story of what I've termed here the ecosystem of handsets or devices and their interaction with the network through the usage that they have. We'll also talk a bit about the tariffs that essentially changed the usage on the network and the impact that that usage from the various subscribers had on the network and some of the challenges that we had. And throughout, we'll talk about the various technological enhancements where relevant. So to start with then, just a simple circle here. It could have been a triangle, it could have been anything, but it was simply to show the necessary interaction between all three of these things. So it wouldn't seem fit in a way for me to talk about handsets, especially working for an operator, if I wasn't also going to talk a little bit at least about the usage and the network. So we've already talked a lot already this morning about handsets or devices in the early days, but in order to take us through, we will start again at the beginning. And again, as we've already discussed, strictly speaking, these weren't handsets. They comprised a handset, but more reliably or accurately, they were called car phones and frequently transportables, because obviously they were transportable, but they lived a lot of their life because of size, etc., in a car. And as you've seen from looking at the devices on display outside, obviously the physical limitations prevented, true portability. Again, if nothing else, if you felt the weight of one of the sealed lead-acid batteries inside these things, that itself was in the order of potentially a kilogram. And the antenna, of course, was a necessary item on the device, given in many cases the state of coverage at the time. But let's not forget, though, functionality was considered advanced because, as was already mentioned previously, the majority of people at the time, in the UK at least, were still using rotary dial equipment. Also, as we've seen the transportable evolve quite quickly to the hand portable, and obviously removing with it the inconvenience of the transportables before. Densification of network operators' coverage obviously helped this. The subsequent design of more devices to work with a lower 600 milliwatt class 4 specification helped, and together that enabled what I would describe as the true path to mobility. Of course, between Cellnet and Vodafone, this increased competition, and in the case of handset advancement, the similarity between the tax system and the AMP system used in the States helps certainly in the case of US manufacturers. Again, here now we've got the NEC P3. Again, that was mentioned specifically in an earlier presentation as being the desired form factor that would become, if you like, the blueprint for GSM. Here we've got the NEC. I think that was from around 1990 that first came our way. And as I also recall, was one of the favourite devices to be chipped in the ending days of tax. And then we arrive and we see the change from the hand portable to the more classic candy bar design that we saw with the Nokia devices of the age, the flip or clamshell phones, which you will have seen outside, and then more recently, I say more recently, still more than 20 years ago at least, to the form factor of the Ericsson 238 device. So let's not forget just how amazing that device was in 1993. The first time I saw one of those, it was as if it could have come from a Christmas cracker and been a toy. It was that small, until you physically picked it up and you felt the crafted aluminium chassis or alloy chassis, and you thought, this is absolutely brilliant. And I remember, again, I think it was Cellnet that had the strapline, the big net for small phones. And these days, people have various straplines for companies that don't really seem to make much sense to me as an engineer. But this this said exactly the way it was. The big network for small phones, that's exactly what we wanted. And again, you know, phone of the year in 1993, even a year later on this magazine, it's still worthy of front page. So now the future moves on and we arrive now at the range of GSM devices. Already spoken this morning about the timeline for the launch of the various UK operators, and certainly Candy Bar and possibly to a lesser extent flip or clamshell devices were the preferred launch devices offered. And let's not forget, we spoke about the cost of the earlier 8500 Motorola being £2,500. Sometime later, these devices were still, for their time, very expensive, and the operator subsidy was necessarily high. So I think the Nokia device is somewhere in the region of £600. I also remember at the time, I think it was Vodafone in an advert on the radio, were trumping call clarity as one of the upselling points for GSM. But remember, in the early days at least, we were still only using the original GSM spec full rate codec, which if you listen to today, doesn't really cut it, but at the time at least it sounded reasonable. And certainly the business community and enterprise community liked the future promise of being able to roam. And then we start to see the world turn, and we see what I've dubbed here a period of time with devices for the masses. So spectrum harmonisation gave GSM a larger global reach, and the opportunity for device growth, I would say, was significant. R&D investment was high by manufacturers. Network operator coverage in all areas was enhanced, and suddenly, you know, improved capability and affordability heightened consumer appeal. So here we've got obviously the Nokia 5110, 5130 I think was the 1800 megahertz variant, and finally a device truly fit as a consumer device, the introduction of the Express on covers, and there's a fantastic display of those outside. I'd forgotten completely the range, but also the variability of quality of those covers. And again, the 5110 wasn't just simply a cut down version of a business phone for once. Having said that, I think the business variant still had Snake at least, but it had true consumer appeal. And also the other thing I remember on the 5110 was the alarm clock, the genius of the fact you could switch the phone off and the alarm would still wake you up in the morning, so you didn't have to worry about whether or not the phone was charged. And then shortly after we had the Nokia 3210, at least on Orange, and I've dubbed this really the playground's choice, because that was one of the first phones I remember as being truly sort of popular amongst teenagers and, quite frankly, kids at the time. The introduction of the text on 9 keys, or predictive T9 text, obviously revolutionised the ability to send text messages. And I remember as an engineer for the first time feeling old when I could see kids literally at bus stops sending text messages behind their back with one hand, and I'd sort of been the person that had switched T9 off because I couldn't make it work. Apart from this as well, I remember coming from like the engineering community being horrified at the fact that for the first time, at least on a Nokia device, the antenna had been hidden. There we are desperately trying to roll out a network and get decent in-building coverage, and suddenly the antenna's disappeared. So, traffic, tariffs, usage in the network. So affordability, a huge potential market, and relatively low device penetration at the time gave rise to certainly competitive times. And as again we've heard this morning, operators set out their various strategies to gain subscribers. So Orange, for example, per second billing, certainly with one-to-one free off-peak calls. Many operators and channels offering no upfront costs on new devices, and certainly competition in the consumer space was very, very fierce. So as an engineer, what did that mean? Well, certainly marketing teams hatched various plans to gain subscribers in their hundreds of thousands, and certainly they achieved that. All I can say is the engineering teams at the time worked hard to try and make sure the network coped. So here we can see a plot, if you like, of traffic, and this was taken from a cell site not too far away from here, covering the Fallowfield area, so very popular campus or student area. And this was, I think, around a week after Orange had launched the Everyday 50 tariff, which was an upsell of the previous Everyday 20 tariff, which gave subscribers 50 minutes of free off-peak calls. So given that that was the student tariff of choice, you can see what it did to the network, because whilst that tariff at its time had been cleverly designed in order to fill spare capacity on the network, certainly in some locations at least, it served to drive absolutely huge spikes in traffic. So the middle plot there, you can see the utilisation of one particular sector of the site. You can see the traditional busy hour at about 5, 6 o'clock, and then you can see this absolutely huge flat line at 7 o'clock because everyone uses their 50 minutes of calls. So obviously that drove a lot of activity on the network in order to try and keep up. Here we go. This also goes back, I don't know if you can see it, but back to 1998. It's amazing I managed to find these actually, to 1999. So this is purely voice traffic, and this was for a group of cell sites in the north of the UK, and just showed that in the space of, well, a year or thereabouts, again, we'd seen a doubling of voice traffic on the network. Now, at that time, that was unprecedented. You can see the dip, the first dip there around October 98. That was as a result of an outage on the platform that collected the stats. But you can see the dip at Christmas and then a dip at Easter. But nevertheless, you can see the relentless growth of the traffic at the time. A couple of things I never forgot to mention there, of course, was that because this was circuit switched voice traffic, we had things like Erlang B, which provided deterministic rules and methods by which we could trend, forecast and dimension the network. So provided the growth was fairly organic and not too unpredictable, we had a chance of being able to keep up. But you compare that today in terms of data usage, doesn't follow the traditional rules of Erlang B or anything else like it, so it's much less deterministic behaviour and much harder to manage or control potentially. As well, all the operators did this, but the deployment of temporary cell sites for initially coverage purposes at special events. So you had a reasonable customer base wanting to go to a variety of events out in the field where perhaps there was no coverage, and in the early days cell sites would be deployed temporarily to provide coverage. Latterly, of course, coverage was there, but the cell sites that served those particular areas couldn't be dimensioned to provide the capacity necessary for the subscribers. So again, temporary cell sites would be deployed, but this time to provide additional capacity. So this particular one was for an event in Leeds, year 2000, and you can see on this particular one at the bottom, we've got a temporary cell site, one sector of it, just purely dimensioned and covering the actual special event area. And you can see over the period of the bank holiday weekend, it absolutely ramps up. So 70 Erlangs on one sector, that was quite a busy GSM sector in those days. And you can see it just dip down back to normal when everyone's finished. The other thing, of course, is look at the busy hour on that site. It's like about 11 o'clock at night when everyone's lost and trying to find their mate. So I thought I'd put a brief mention here of the two matrix type devices. The 7110, not strictly from the film, but certainly inspired by it with the sprung loaded flip on it. I got mine out the other day and I pressed the button and it was just like, it was almost like it was dampened. It certainly needs some oil. But of course, this was the first WAP device that Nokia had. And although oversold in some respects, as we heard this morning, it certainly did pave the way for the mobile internet. So we've also spoke about the phenomenal success of text messaging. So text messaging using SMS became the craze of a whole new generation. And of course, as operators, we loved it too because of the low network touch. So agreed we had to dimension SMS gateways, but in terms of the utilisation and load on the radio access network, it was quite low touch. So the revenue that we gained was in many cases largely profit. So as operators, we're obviously keen to repeat that success with the introduction of photo messaging and to a lesser extent potentially with video calling. So here we just show the Nokia 7650, which also was the first Nokia device with a Symbian operating system. It's interesting at the time to think that it actually sold really well as a camera phone, but actually even then as a camera it was totally useless with like 0.3 megapixels. It doesn't cut it by today's standards. And the other thing, devices for the enterprise. Although Orange wasn't the first operator or carrier in the UK to have the BlackBerry, it's certainly worth a mention here because it was great to hear Stuart this morning mention the effect it had on him when he saw the speed with which the service could deliver emails. I remember at the time, maybe 9 or so years ago, I was working for Vodafone, and if I'd have been in the sales community rather than the engineering fraternity, I'm sure I'd be able to retire earlier because these devices sold themselves. You could be with a customer, they could send an email to their colleague and it would arrive on a BlackBerry device quicker frequently than it would arrive on a desktop on their own domain. So it was fantastic. And things like over-the-air provisioning, AES and triple DES encryption, remote device management and wiping, ultimately earned the platform CESG approval in the UK. So it was popular within government and certain home office departments and, truly unrepeatable at the time. So moving further forward then, we come on to the emergence, if you like, of the smartphone. So the eagerly awaited HTC device launching Windows Mobile. Again, remember, this is still a 2G device in 2002. So the original SPV Classic, as it was called in the UK at least, no camera, but it had a fantastic screen and it could render regular HTTP pages. So it actually, for the first time, looked like you had the proper internet on a device, at least my recollection anyway. And the sort of Microsoft look and feel with Outlook and Media Player actually felt more like a computer. I would say in the early days, though, we weren't quick to exploit the corporate markets, despite the fact that it had good Outlook integration. So with the arrival of 3G, with UMTS, a new radio access network, new devices, an expensive auction, and a new operator in the UK, but essentially what was the upsell? Video calling obviously had been trumped as the new killer app, but arguably not everyone was convinced. There was no big appetite yet for data, and there was no latent demand therefore. Some within the industry were reluctant to promote the mobile internet, especially in the wake of WAP, as we've heard. And compared with the more refined 2G only devices of the time, what was the perceived benefit? And that was partly the issue. And interestingly, as we'll see later, again, one of the reasons why Apple chose to launch the original iPhone as a 2G only device. So here we see on the left the Nokia 6650. We used that as a test device in years gone by. It never launched in the UK, but I believe in North America it was a real device. And latterly the 6680, I think that is on the right, and that was the first Nokia device with a front-facing camera. So again, good for video calling if you used it. But luckily, 3G devices continued to evolve and gain market share. So on the right-hand side, this was the first Samsung phone I remember using and thinking, wow, we've actually got a vendor here that's making really, really good phones to compete with the best of what we'd seen before. So for example, in 2005, that Z500 was one of the lightest devices, especially 3G device at less than 100 grams. The battery life of it was legendary, comparable with a 2G device, and they must have realised that, Samsung, because they were cocky enough to have a backlit display when the clamshell was shut that was permanently illuminated to reveal a LED clock and the signal strength permanently on, even when the device was off, I think. But it was very good. The only irony, of course, was that many customers chose it because they liked the device. They had no idea it was actually a 3G phone. But luckily, again, things continue to move. And for example, there I've shown what I've described here as a belt and braces enterprise device. I remember in about 2006, they were popular when I was working at Vodafone. They were popular with corporate and enterprise customers. Being Windows Mobile, they could deploy their own bespoke applications to it to be used within a work environment. And many of these actually necessitated a 3G bearer to actually work properly. So for the first time, at least, it looked like the 3G network was going to earn us some money. And I'm pleased Errol as well mentioned HSPA before me, because of course that's another story. This picture, courtesy of Andy Sutton, shows, if you like, the arrival of what we term Dongle Mania. Because if we think about that really quickly, handset data consumption at the time was low. Tablets didn't really exist, or certainly hadn't penetrated the market. However, in contrast, laptops with browsers were popular and quite well refined. But a lack of built-in 3G within laptops, at least as standard, and fewer Wi-Fi hotspots around fueled, if you like, the use of dongles. And with the HSPA customer experience, it wasn't difficult at all to achieve, a user experience surpassing that of dial-up services, and in many cases with a good signal, an experience exceeding that of ADSL. So, enter the smartphone and a new generation of killer apps. So, the evolution of the smartphone really signalled a change that has luckily seen a lot of new growth within the industry. And on the right-hand side there, I've just listed, if you like, some of the main factors I think that have helped drive that. So, not just new devices, operating systems, obviously the arrival of iOS and Android, operating systems that mean you can happily, reliably drive the device without needing a stylus, as we saw in the early Windows Mobile experience. App stores which basically drive the imagination so that you can use your phone in an entirely bespoke and personal to you manner, as again was mentioned earlier this morning. The improvements we saw with HSPA and now the advent of 4G, and of course the other things that we've come to expect on phones, such as decent cameras and displays. And the other thing as well is the explosion of social media. First for the mobile internet and cloud content driving use of the network, and if you like, the means these days of consuming media in non-real time using streaming services rather than traditional broadcast channels. I mean, one thing is, how many devices these days do you know still have an FM radio? None. And yet one day that was like a standard upsell of any device. Because nowadays, if you want your music, it's either on the device, or you listen to it in the cloud, or you stream it. So just before we begin to summarise here, a couple of slides here, just charting, if you like, the evolution of devices in terms of the form factor. So if you look at arguably the perfect form factor pre-smartphone, I mean, look at this. My car keys there are virtually the same size as the devices. I think people forget sometimes just how small they got. Again, the antenna usually hidden, but I think the Motorola V66 was obviously a notable exception there, with it still being there. Flip or clamshell device is still popular with some, and in certain markets globally very popular still. always a multi-band device, keyboard and display minimised, because all you need to do is read text after all. Data capability is less important. If you want data, you use a lead or connect it via Bluetooth. And certainly those two devices I had down as being among the smallest. Compare that today now with the arrival of the smartphone. So here's an original first generation Apple iPhone. Screen size now is obviously maximised. We don't have a keyboard. We can use the display as the keyboard. We don't need a stylus. Phones now have an internal speaker, not just so much about making hands-free or off-hook calls, more about the fact that you want to consume proper media on the devices, as in watch films or listen to music. And the aspect ratio of a device being as much about the aspect ratio of the media content that you want to see and look at, as much about that as actually what the device looks and feels like. And also the other interesting thing is a little discernible difference between, if you like, the telephony versus non-telephony variants. I mean, if you look at an iPod Touch, compare that with an iPod, actually they look very, very similar. And moving on then to the iPhone effect. So much more than just telephony, to the extent now that telephony usage in many respects is often considered a secondary use of the device itself. And even if telephony use was the primary use of the device, other over-the-top services like the FaceTime voice-only calling, Skype calls, even I noticed Facebook Messenger has an HD voice call service now, so all detracting from the traditional telephony use of the devices. Again, the variety of instant messaging apps, audio and video streaming becoming the norm, etc., etc. And again, the reason I said iPhone effect as well is because of the propensity these devices have to consume network resource, even when the devices are effectively offline as far as the user is concerned. So app updates and transactions on the fly in the background often consume quite large amounts of data. Android, I think, to a slightly lesser extent, but certainly iOS 4 and 6 were two big iOS releases which drove a lot of invisible network utilization. Last couple of slides here, just illustrating smartphone use and trends. So here we've got, this goes back to 2012, 2013, so not long after EE at least had launched its 4G network. You can see now already the red line is the 4G utilization or aggregated traffic over a period of a day. You can see it's already eclipsed that of 3G, and interestingly, this isn't my slide, it wasn't my discovery, I wish it had been, but interestingly you see those two, it tracks 3G quite nicely, and then all of a sudden there's this departure. So obviously that resulted in some investigation, and suddenly 2 football matches of the Saturday. You can even see half time. So what's interesting though is that was taken not long after launch, so it'll be interesting to see in time whether those effects become more or less prevalent as the subscriber base increases, but it does show the difference in utilisation, because let's face it, reliable 3G streaming wouldn't probably have been as possible or as attractive. So to summarise then, despite the maturity of the form factor, devices will still continue to evolve. The data demand is set for considerable growth still over the next 5 years. The improved coverage and performance will continue to drive 4G usage, especially as we continue to roll out 800 megahertz spectrum. Greater volume and diversity of applications will stimulate growth. We heard about that this morning also. And the global appetite for upgrading smartphones will certainly continue. I did have some figures, but they've gone from my head, but it's certainly billions, I would say, globally. And the ecosystem of the device, the user and the network will continue to gather momentum. Thank you.